Okay, what I have here today is the steering column and steering box from the Riley 9. I actually have two of these and I've already stripped down one of them. Not completely, I've actually got stuck at one point, which we can get to a bit later. But I'm going to go ahead and strip down the second one, being very careful to keep all the parts of each set together. And I'll pull this all apart and we can see what it looks like. There's a shaft that runs all the way down through, and there's actually a bearing up the top here, as well as bearings at the bottom. For a little car, these are really quite beefy. They're very, very solid. And the first one I've pulled apart doesn't look to have any wear in it at all. The reason I'm pulling them apart, one, just to clean them up and make sure they're all adjusted correctly and clean and there's nothing wrong with them. But the other reason is because I'm building a Riley Brooklands replica, the standard steering column here, which I believe is 36 inches from this point up to the top bearing, they're too long. And if you tried to use that steering column in a Brooklands replica, you wouldn't be able to get into the car. The steering wheel would be too close to you. So this needs to be taken apart and shortened. It looks like the outer tube is no problem to shorten. This will all come apart when I take this lid off. We'll have a look what's in there. This collar here, which is where the top bearing sits, this actually comes off. You just sort of knock that off. So this outer tube can definitely be shortened, and it's going to need to be shortened about 6 inches. So about that far, I think it is. The outer tube, no problem. The inner tube, I'm not so sure about yet, because that's the piece I haven't been able to completely dismantle on the other steering box. So this one's a bit cleaner. I'm going to go ahead and basically you pull this apart. I'll take this lever off the top. This is actually broken or been cut off. These levers are for the throttle pedal. So the pedal comes up to here and it sends it across the top of the box and then up to the carburetors, I believe. I guess I'll figure that out when I get to building it. So I'm going to take all these bolts out and we'll pull this one apart and have a look inside. I still haven't got my camera mount, so I can't film me actually doing it. That would probably be boring anyway. So I'll take this lid off and we'll see what's in there. So I have all the bolts out and I've taken a little cross shaft out. So we should now just be able to take the cover off. Now, one interesting thing is there's no gasket, because the steering box is filled up with grease, not oil. I guess you don't need one, but those mounting surfaces must be very smooth, so the grease doesn't leak out. The first box I pulled apart was much older and it was filthy. It was just caked in grease inside there. So this is the two gears that actually make the steering work. I'm not sure if I can turn it. Oh yes, I can. That turns very easily. So normally what happens in the car is the drop arm attaches to this shaft, and this does what it says. It drops down and it fits to a bar that's called they either call it a tiller rod or the drag link. I've seen it named as both. And that goes forward to the steering arm on the swivel axle. So when the steering wheel, which is normally attached up here on this taper, turns, it turns that big gear, which turns the gear attached to the drop arm. It's very simple. This should now just more or less lift up. One thing to note is on here, this collar, there's this kind of ramp machined on it, and I believe that is so that you can adjust something. I'm not sure exactly. Let's see if we can. This just drops out. This is all one piece, And this is the piece that I'm having trouble with on the other box that I've got. I haven't been able to disassemble this end of the column. So there's a big nut on the end here that comes off. There's a spring clip that holds it. I'll clean all the grease and stuff off this and we can have a closer look. And then this gear seems to be attached on it's probably on a taper, and there is a key holding it. But I have not been able to separate that on the other column I've got. So it'll be interesting to see if this one is any easier to take apart. This should just drop off. I believe it's just held by grease at the moment. It's very stuck. So I can't really do it with one hand. I think the grease is just holding it in place. But this should pull off. And then I'll go and degrease all this and we can take a look at it clean. This is very tricky with one hand because I'm getting covered in grease and I don't want to touch my phone, the touchscreen, with greasy fingers, so it's getting a bit awkward. I have all the grease cleaned off these parts now, so we can get a better look at how it all goes together. Each half of the casing has a large bush in it. You can see there are grooves in there for the oil, or for the grease rather. This wheel, the main gear wheel, it has a ball bearing embedded in the end. So that is to provide the adjustment on the gear. So this bush here is threaded, and there's actually this little adjustment bolt. You can see where it's been, if it'll focus. There we go. You can see the little indentation on the end where it's been pressing on the ball. So this actually screws into here. It does, believe me. That screws in there, and by adjusting that and then using the lock nut, you can adjust the mesh of this main wheel up and down like that. The end of the screw, of course, pushes on the bearing. So this fits in there really well. There's no wear at all. I'm really impressed for something that's 80 or 90 years old. Unless these have been replaced, but I doubt it. I'm assuming these are still original. So this would have been a car from I guess from the 30s. So, we're talking 80-year-old stuff. And it's just so well built and the quality is so high. I just need to clean it up and I can put it all back together basically. There doesn't seem to be any wear on the teeth. These will need another cleanup. I've basically done what they say to do in all the old manuals. I've run out of degreaser. So I did what they say in all the old books, and I've been using petrol. I was doing that outside, of course, where it's a bit breezy, so there are no fumes, and I'm pretty happy that I did. Actually, that might just be the fumes talking, but it's actually worked really well. It cleaned all the grease off, no problem. So we can see here as well, this will need a clean up, but it doesn't look like there's any wear on any of this. And you can see how this turns independently off this outer collar. Now, the nut on the end, if we turn that around, is held with this little spring clip. So I'm going to pop this off and then I can undo this. These nuts all have little slots on them, so you need a little C-spanner, which over here, covered in muck. You need a tool like this to be able to get them off. Now, I really need two of these. Unfortunately, I've only got this one. So to be able to do this, what I've been doing is holding this in the vice jaws, just across the flats, and you can get enough of a grip on it that it won't turn, and you can actually undo these nuts with the C-spanner here. The other thing that's interesting is the shafts for the controls that go down through the middle of the column. So there's one control for changing the advance on the magneto, and there's another one which is a hand throttle. Not actually sure which one's which. I'll figure that out at the time. But these are really neat. So these have these little copper sort of collars on them. They're sort of split. They seem to be made out of brass. There's 3 of them on each shaft. There's one at the end here, which is pretty gummed up. And what these seem to be able to do is, this means the shafts don't rattle around inside the hollow shaft. So this smaller one goes inside this one, and then this one goes down the steering column. So these sort of bushes stop these rattling and also give a little bit of resistance on them. They're really quite neat. I've not seen that before. So on the Austin 7, for example, they're just tubes rubbing inside each other that run down the steering column. So this is really quite nice. There is a wire hanging out of here because there is a horn button that screws on the end. There are 2 little screws that go in from the bottom here. Unfortunately, I don't have the horn button. I'm not sure exactly what it looks like, but that's what that wire is for. I really need to see if I can extract that wire, which might be a bit tricky. I may fill the column up with penetrating fluid and see if I can carefully pull that wire out. We'll have to see how that goes. But I'll keep going and I'll see if I can strip down the rest of this column. And we can have a look at the bearings and things that are up in the top here and also down here in the bottom. I do have to keep stopping, taking my gloves off, because I've been wearing gloves while I've been doing all this, especially when I've been washing things out in petrol. And then to work the phone, I have to take the gloves off, go and wash my hands, and then come back out. So gloves back on, and we'll do the next bit. So there's been some success. I've finally managed to get this whole thing apart, mostly all apart. The trick was getting the things off the end here. This is a very, very tight interference fit, and there's also a key. So it took a lot of penetrating fluid. This is the penetrating fluid I use. It's called mouse milk. I got it from my friend Richard in the Vintage Austin Club. I don't know where he got it from. I'm assuming he sits on a tiny little stool and milks about 1,000 mice to get a bottle of this stuff, but it works really well. Plenty of that, a little bit of heat, not too much, because these are gears and I don't want to upset any heat treatments or anything, just enough to warm them up. And I think the combination of the heat and the penetrating fluid means that it can soak in there. And then I basically used the drunk octopus here, the gear puller. These things are a pain because everything's all loose and floppy. I keep meaning to replace these nuts with nylocks so that there's movement in it, but it's all holds stiff, because it's quite awkward to use. What I did was I machined up the end off a bolt just to make it flat, and I put a little groove in it so that I could fit that into the end of the shaft and rest the center of the gear puller on that. That worked pretty well. So this is all apart. If we start up at the top end, this is the end of the steering shaft. It's threaded and it has a taper, which is where the steering wheel goes. I'll have to clean all this up. So if we go backwards down along the shaft and see all the different bits, there's the nut that holds the steering wheel on. There's this lock nut, which jams up against this piece. Now this piece, this bit here, is what goes on the end of the outer shaft. And this is a tight push fit on there. And you can pop that off, and inside this is the top thrust bearing. So that's the bottom race that goes in there. You may notice there's something missing here. This column is in really, really good condition. Everything looks really nice, except the top ball race is missing, which is why I presume this has gone all rusty. So I'll have to see if I can get a replacement. I'm not sure if they make them anymore. If not, I'll have to cannibalize parts from the other column I've taken apart. So you've got the top face of the bearing. It's a This one's a SKF, made in England. I'm guessing it's been a while since they've done that. You'd have the ball race in between here, and then you've got the bottom face of the bearing, which pushes into the top there. So that all goes at the top of the column. And then if we work down, starting at the bottom here, this all fits inside the bottom of this housing, which is what connects to the two halves of the case. So there's a big nut that goes on the end there, and that's held with this little spring clip when it's in place. So there's a hole in the shaft that locks into. Obviously you don't want any of this to come undone, because that's your steering and that would be bad. This is the gear, which is actually still warm, and that's a really tight push fit onto the end of that shaft, and there's a woodruff key to hold it as well. Then we have a bearing. This is quite a beefy bearing, which seems in good condition. I can reuse this. This is also made in England, but this one's a Hoffman. And that sits down against this little collar. And this slides down onto here. And this was quite a tight fit as well, but again, the same trick, a bit of penetrating fluid, and then I pulled that off. It took me a little while to realize it was a collar, but then looking at the shaft, I realized that must be a separate piece, because there were no, if it had been machined, there'd be a slight curve on the inside there. The other way I could tell is I put the penetrating fluid on it and then I heat it up. And if you see little bubbles coming up around the inside of the hole and the edge of the shaft, you know it's probably a pressed on piece. So that's pressed on there. And then we have another thrust bearing. And this is the one at the bottom. So you have the two races like that. And that sits on there. So that actually goes onto that collar like that. So this looks brand new. I'm guessing it isn't, but again, this is the same as the top, the SKF made in England ones. So that all goes on the bottom there. So this whole column is pretty solid. I mean, it's got beefy thrust bearings and a big bearing at the bottom here. There's no wear in the gears that I can see, so these mesh together like that, of course. I guess these things last because they're sitting there full of grease or oil most of their life, and I'm assuming there aren't really very heavy loads on them. You can see a little bit of sort of scuffing on that, but not really any wear. So what I need to do is, to get it to work in the Brooklands, like I mentioned, we need to shorten it. It's about 6 inches. I need to check the measurement, but it's 5 or 6 inches. Also, what steering wheel you use can affect that, because if you've got a flat wheel, of course, the plane of the wheel is here, but you could get different size wheels, or you could do what I did on the Austin 7, which was I actually brought the wheel out by bending the spokes. So instead of the spokes being flat, I bent them so they went out like that and then up. And then I trimmed sections out of the edge of the rim, because you've moved it out, so you actually make the diameter slightly smaller, and then welded it back up and rebuilt the edge. On this, I'm probably going to use a flat wheel. I think that's probably more or less what they were like. So this outer one is going to be fairly easy. I just need to find someone with a lathe big enough that this can fit through, and they can just machine off the end, and then I press this back on, which I should be able to do now, because one of the things I bought recently was the little press there. Interestingly, it's not tall enough for me to actually fit the shaft in. So if I try to put the shaft vertically, I don't have enough height. But I guess there's nothing that says this has to be used vertically. I can always sort of tip it over or lean it on its side and sort of rig something up on the bottom to hold clamp the shaft thing in place. We'll see when I get to that point. But this inner column needs shortening as well. So I'm guessing what I'm going to need to do is find somebody who can recreate this, but further down. So I'll need to find a really good machine shop who can do this for me. I can't do it here. I wouldn't trust myself to do it here either. These shafts, this one and the other one, you can both see where they've been gripped in a vise before. You can see the teeth there. So I don't know if that means they would have been rebuilt at some point, or if that was just how they were done at the factory. I don't really know. It's interesting that both of them have that though. So that's what I do next. I'm going to keep cleaning this up. I'll get all the rust and stuff off it, make it really, really clean. I have done zinc plating before, but I'm wondering if it'd be worth investing in a nickel plating kit. I'm pretty sure you can buy those. So you can nickel plate at home and nickel plate some of these pieces, which are all the pieces that are visible at the top of the steering column. They seem to have had some sort of shiny coating on them. Of course, they're all rusted now, but that should all clean up quite nicely. I can figure out what I'm going to do with it. So that's the steering column taken apart. Oh, and one final thing. That chamfer on the bottom of the main piece of the column, the reason for it's pretty obvious when you look at it. It's so it clears the gear teeth here. You need this clearance. That's all that's for. I thought maybe it was part of the adjustment, but no, it's just to provide clearance there.